drives a man to ignore the largest military buildup in human history happening directly on his doorstep. By the spring of 1941, Joseph Stalin possessed arguably the most extensive intelligence network in the world, yet he systematically dismissed every warning about an imminent German invasion. This paradox would cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives and nearly determine the outcome of the Second World War. The foundation of Stalin's fatal miscalculation lay in the events of August 1939, when Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed the Non-Aggression Pact in Moscow. The public treaty promised 10 years of peace between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The secret protocol, however, divided Poland and the Baltic states between the two powers. Stalin viewed this agreement not merely as a temporary truce, but as a strategic masterpiece that would allow the Soviet Union to avoid the devastating war consuming Western Europe while simultaneously expanding Soviet territory. The immediate aftermath of the pact seemed to validate Stalin's strategy. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west, while Soviet forces occupied eastern Poland, incorporating approximately 13 million new citizens into the USSR. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania fell under Soviet control by August 1940, adding another 6 million people to Stalin's empire. Finland's resistance during the Winter War of 1939-1940 proved costlier than anticipated, but still resulted in Soviet territorial gains along the crucial Karelian border. By early 1941, the Soviet Union controlled a buffer zone stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, precisely the strategic depth Stalin believed would protect the motherland from future invasions. The Red Army numbered approximately 5.5 million active personnel, with thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces positioned along the new western frontier. Soviet industrial production had increased dramatically since the first five-year plan of 1928, with steel output reaching 18 million tons annually and coal production exceeding 160 million tons. Stalin's confidence in his strategic position rested on his assessment of Germany's military limitations. German forces remained engaged in active combat across multiple fronts throughout 1940 and early 1941. The Battle of Britain consumed significant Luftwaffe resources, while German submarines fought an intensive campaign against British shipping in the Atlantic. Most critically, German Afrika Korps units under General Erwin Rommel struggled against British forces in North Africa, requiring continuous reinforcement and supply. The Soviet leader calculated that Hitler possessed insufficient resources to sustain simultaneous campaigns against Britain, Africa, and the Soviet Union. Basic military logistics supported this assessment. Germany imported crucial raw materials from the Soviet Union under their economic agreement, including 1,600,000 tons of grain, 900,000 tons of oil, and substantial quantities of manganese, chromium, and other strategic metals. Attacking the Soviet Union would eliminate Germany's primary source of these materials while adding a massive new front requiring millions of troops. Stalin's personal experience with military planning reinforced his conviction that Germany could not risk a two-front war. During his participation in the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1921, he had witnessed how divided military efforts inevitably led to defeat. The German Empire's collapse in 1918, after fighting simultaneous campaigns against Russia, France, Britain, and the United States, provided historical precedent for his strategic thinking. The Soviet intelligence apparatus operating throughout Europe in 1941 represented the most sophisticated espionage network ever assembled. The NKVD maintained active agents in Berlin, London, Tokyo, Washington, and dozens of other capitals. Soviet military intelligence, known as the GRU, operated parallel networks focused specifically on military capabilities and intentions. These organizations employed thousands of professional intelligence officers, recruited assets throughout European governments and military establishments, and maintained communication systems capable of transmitting information from Berlin to Moscow within hours. Economic intelligence suggested Germany lacked the industrial capacity for a prolonged Eastern campaign. Soviet economists calculated that German steel production, while impressive at approximately 23 million tons annually, remained insufficient to equip armies for the vast distances involved in Russian warfare. German oil reserves appeared particularly inadequate. Romania provided Germany's primary petroleum source, producing approximately 6 million tons annually, but this quantity could not sustain mechanized divisions across the 1,000-mile front a Soviet invasion would require. Stalin's analysis of German military doctrine further supported his position. Wehrmacht success in Poland, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, and France had demonstrated the effectiveness of rapid, concentrated attacks against specific objectives. However, these campaigns involved relatively short distances and clearly defined territorial goals. The Soviet Union presented an entirely different challenge. From the Bug River to Moscow, measured 800 kilometers. From the western frontier to the Ural Mountains, stretched over 2,000 kilometers. German forces would face the same geographical challenges that had destroyed Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1812. The Soviet military leadership, while privately expressing concerns about German intentions, publicly supported Stalin's assessment. Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of General Staff Georgy Zhukov had overseen massive military modernization programs throughout 1940 and early 1941. New T-34 tanks, superior to any German armor, had entered production at multiple facilities. The Red Army possessed approximately 23,000 tanks in 1941, compared to approximately 3,500 German tanks available for Eastern operations. Soviet aircraft production had similarly expanded dramatically. Factories produced approximately 100 aircraft monthly by early 1941. With new designs like the Yak-1 fighter and Il-2 ground attack aircraft, demonstrating technological advancement competitive with German models. The Red Army operated approximately 18,000 aircraft. Though many remained older models requiring replacement, artillery represented perhaps the Red Army's greatest strength. Soviet doctrine emphasized massive artillery concentrations, and weapons production reflected this priority. The Red Army possessed over 150,000 artillery pieces, ranging from 76mm divisional guns to massive 203mm howitzers capable of destroying German fortifications. Stalin's conviction that Hitler would not risk attacking the Soviet Union also reflected his understanding of Nazi ideology and German strategic culture. National Socialist doctrine portrayed the Soviet Union as Germany's ideological enemy, but it simultaneously emphasized the practical benefits of maintaining the non-aggression pact. German newspapers and radio broadcasts throughout 1940 and early 1941 consistently praised Soviet cooperation and emphasized the mutual benefits of continued peace. The psychological dimension of Stalin's miscalculation involved his assessment of Hitler's personality and decision-making patterns. Stalin believed Hitler, despite his ideological extremism, remained fundamentally rational in strategic matters. The German leader had successfully avoided premature conflicts with major powers throughout his rise to power. His decision to remilitarize the Rhineland in 1936, annex Austria in 1938, and occupy Czechoslovakia in 1939 demonstrated careful timing and calculated risk assessment. This behavioral pattern suggested Hitler would not initiate a massive Eastern campaign while Britain remained unconquered, and American involvement in the war appeared increasingly likely. President Franklin Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program, announced in March 1941, clearly indicated American intentions to support Britain regardless of official neutrality. Hitler surely recognized that attacking the Soviet Union would accelerate American entry into the war and create the precise three-front scenario Germany could not survive. The systematic dismissal of intelligence warnings that began reaching Moscow in late 1940 represented one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in modern history. These warnings arrived through multiple independent sources, each providing specific details about German military preparations that should have prompted immediate defensive measures. Instead, Stalin's response demonstrated how absolute power could transform strategic caution into national suicide. The first credible warning came from Richard Sorge, the Soviet Union's most valuable intelligence asset in East Asia. Operating undercover as a German journalist in Tokyo, Sorge had cultivated relationships within both the German embassy and Japanese government circles. In December 1940, Sorge transmitted information indicating that Germany planned to attack the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941. His report specified that German forces were being repositioned from Western Europe to Poland and East Prussia in preparation for a massive offensive operation. Sorge's intelligence possessed exceptional credibility due to his track record and access to high-level sources. He had accurately predicted Germany's invasion of Norway and Denmark in April 1940, the German offensive in Western Europe in May 1940, and Japan's decision to advance southward into Southeast Asia rather than attacking the Soviet Union's eastern territories. His December 1940 warning included specific details about German troop movements, railway transportation schedules, and discussions between German and Japanese officials regarding coordination of anti-Soviet operations. Soviet military intelligence received corroborating information from agents operating throughout Europe during the first months of 1941. From Berlin came reports of massive military construction projects in East Prussia, including new airfields, ammunition depots, and supply bases positioned within striking distance of Soviet territory. From Warsaw arrived intelligence about German engineers surveying bridge capacities across rivers throughout occupied Poland, suggesting preparations for heavy military traffic moving eastward. British intelligence sources provided additional confirmation of German intentions. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally warned Stalin about impending attack through diplomatic channels in April 1941. Churchill's message, delivered through the British ambassador in Moscow, included specific intelligence about German troop concentrations and revealed British knowledge of German planning documents. This warning carried particular significance because Britain had every strategic interest in preventing German-Soviet reconciliation. The warnings reached Stalin through multiple overlapping intelligence networks, making coordinated deception virtually impossible. The NKVD received reports from agents in occupied territories throughout Eastern Europe. The GRU operated independent sources within the German military establishment. Soviet diplomatic personnel in Berlin observed firsthand the obvious military preparations occurring throughout German-controlled territory. Physical evidence of German preparations became increasingly obvious throughout the spring of 1941. German reconnaissance aircraft began violating Soviet airspace on a daily basis, photographing military installations, transportation networks, and defensive positions along the western frontier. Between January and June 1941, Soviet air defenses detected over 500 unauthorized German flights over Soviet territory. These reconnaissance missions followed systematic patterns, suggesting comprehensive intelligence gathering for offensive operations. German diplomatic behavior provided additional warning signs that Stalin chose to ignore. Throughout early 1941, German officials began avoiding routine diplomatic contacts with their Soviet counterparts, Scheduled meetings were postponed or cancelled without explanation. German trade representatives delayed negotiations regarding promised delivery of military equipment and industrial machinery. The economic cooperation that had characterized German-Soviet relations since 1939 gradually deteriorated despite Soviet efforts to maintain normal business relationships. The most obvious indicator of German intentions involved the massive military buildup occurring directly along Soviet borders. By May 1941, German forces in occupied Poland numbered approximately 3 million troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. This concentration represented the largest military force assembled in human history up to that point. Concealing such a massive deployment from Soviet intelligence proved impossible, yet Stalin consistently dismissed reports of this buildup as either defensive measures or preparations for invading Britain. Stalin's response to mounting intelligence warnings demonstrated the systematic nature of his denial. Rather than investigating these reports or implementing precautionary measures, he ordered the execution or imprisonment of intelligence officers who continued transmitting warnings about German intentions. The NKVD arrested dozens of agents throughout 1941 for allegedly spreading panic or disseminating enemy disinformation. This policy effectively silenced the intelligence apparatus precisely when accurate information became most crucial. The Soviet leader's treatment of Richard Sorge exemplified his systematic dismissal of unwelcome intelligence. Despite Sorge's proven accuracy and access to high-level sources, Stalin branded him a provocateur, working to entangle the Soviet Union in unnecessary conflict with Germany. Moscow Center instructed Sorge to focus his reporting on Japanese activities rather than German military preparations. This directive effectively eliminated the Soviet Union's best intelligence source regarding German intentions during the critical months preceding the invasion. Soviet military commanders along the western frontier recognized the obvious signs of impending attack, but received strict orders not to implement defensive measures that might provoke German retaliation. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Military District, repeatedly requested permission to move forward deployed units to more defensible positions and place frontier troops on higher alert status. Stalin personally rejected these requests, ordering Pavlov to avoid any actions that might be interpreted as provocative by German observers. The contradiction between obvious German preparations and Soviet policy created an impossible situation for Soviet military leadership. Field commanders observed massive German troop concentrations, aggressive reconnaissance flights, and clear offensive preparations occurring directly across their borders. However, implementing logical defensive responses risked court-martial for violating explicit orders from Moscow. This paralysis would prove catastrophic when German attacks actually commenced. Stalin's personal involvement in intelligence assessment eliminated normal checking mechanisms that might have corrected his strategic miscalculation. Intelligence reports normally underwent analysis by multiple departments before reaching senior leadership. However, Stalin insisted on personally reviewing all intelligence related to German intentions. His systematic rejection of warnings effectively prevented alternative assessments from reaching other Soviet leaders who might have questioned his conclusions. The practical consequences of Stalin's intelligence failures became apparent in Soviet military deployment throughout early 1941. Rather than concentrating forces for defensive operations, Soviet units remained dispersed in peacetime configurations. Ammunition stockpiles sat in rear depots rather than forward positions where they would be needed during combat. Aircraft remained lined up on airfields without dispersal or camouflage measures that would protect them from surprise attack. Soviet communication systems reflected the same dangerous complacency that characterized overall military preparations, Radio networks operated on predictable schedules using standard frequencies that German intelligence could easily monitor and disrupt. Command posts remained in permanent locations without backup facilities or alternative communication methods. This systematic vulnerability would enable German forces to paralyze Soviet command and control systems within hours of beginning their offensive. The most tragic aspect of Stalin's intelligence failure involved the human cost of his strategic blindness. Millions of Soviet soldiers positioned along the western frontier received no warning of impending attack. They remained in summer barracks rather than prepared defensive positions. Their weapons stayed in storage rather than ready for immediate use. When German artillery began falling on Soviet positions at precisely 3:30 on the morning of June 22, 1941, most Soviet troops had no idea their country was at war. The critical voice that Stalin systematically silenced belonged to Lieutenant General Philip Golikov, head of the main intelligence directorate of the Red Army General Staff. Golikov occupied the most senior intelligence position in the Soviet military hierarchy, responsible for evaluating and synthesizing all intelligence regarding foreign military threats. His assessment of German intentions directly contradicted Stalin's strategic assumptions, making him both the most qualified expert on the subject and the most dangerous challenger to official policy. Golikov had risen through the Soviet military intelligence system through exceptional analytical capability and political reliability. Born in 1900 to a peasant family in Kostroma province, he joined the Red Army during the Russian Civil War and demonstrated remarkable aptitude for intelligence work. Unlike many senior Soviet officers whose careers depended primarily on political loyalty, Golikov possessed genuine expertise in military analysis, foreign languages, and international relations. His position as GRU chief provided access to intelligence from dozens of sources throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Soviet military intelligence maintained networks in every major capital, operated listening posts along strategic frontiers, and employed technical specialists capable of intercepting and decoding foreign communications. Golikov personally reviewed the most sensitive intelligence before preparing assessments for Stalin and the Defense Commissariat. Throughout late 1940 and early 1941, Golikov compiled increasingly alarming evidence of German offensive preparations. His intelligence summaries documented specific details about German troop movements, equipment transfers, and construction projects that could only be explained by preparations for a massive invasion. Railroad intelligence indicated transportation of entire German divisions from Western Europe to positions along Soviet borders. Construction intelligence revealed German engineers building forward airfields, fuel depots, and communication centers within striking distance of Soviet territory. Golikov's January 1941 intelligence assessment provided Stalin with the most comprehensive analysis of German intentions available to any intelligence service in the world. This document detailed German order of battle along the eastern frontier, identifying specific divisions, their commanders, and their positions. It calculated German logistical capabilities, analyzing fuel supplies, ammunition stockpiles, and transportation assets required for sustained offensive operations. Most significantly, it provided a timeline indicating German forces would achieve readiness for major offensive operations by late May or early June 1941. The intelligence chief's analysis went beyond simple reporting to include strategic assessment of German capabilities and limitations. Golikov calculated that Germany possessed sufficient resources for a major offensive lasting approximately 3 to 4 months, but lacked the logistical depth for a prolonged campaign extending into winter months. This assessment suggested German strategy would focus on achieving rapid, decisive victory through capture of major Soviet industrial and population centers before winter weather complicated military operations. Stalin's response to Golikov's intelligence assessments revealed the fundamental disconnect between evidence and ideology that would prove catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Rather than engaging with the substance of Golikov's reports, Stalin accused him of exaggerating German threats and falling victim to British disinformation designed to entangle the Soviet Union in unnecessary conflict with Germany. The Soviet leader ordered Golikov to focus his analysis on defensive German preparations rather than offensive capabilities. The specific instructions Stalin provided to Golikov demonstrated how political pressure corrupted intelligence analysis. Stalin demanded that all assessments of German intentions emphasize evidence supporting continued German-Soviet cooperation, while minimizing information suggesting offensive preparations. Intelligence reports were to highlight German difficulties in other theaters of operation and stress German dependence on Soviet raw materials for sustained military operations. Golikov found himself trapped between professional responsibility and political survival. His extensive experience in intelligence work made clear that German preparations could only be explained by offensive intentions. However, providing accurate assessments risked career destruction and possibly worse consequences. Previous intelligence officials who had contradicted Stalin's strategic assumptions had faced imprisonment or execution. The pressure to conform to Stalin's expectations created a systematic distortion of intelligence reporting throughout the Soviet system. Golikov instructed his subordinates to emphasize intelligence that supported peaceful German intentions while downplaying evidence of offensive preparations. Field intelligence officers learned to phrase their reports in ways that acknowledged obvious German military activities without drawing conclusions that might contradict official policy. This systematic distortion had practical consequences for Soviet military preparations. Intelligence assessments that minimized German offensive capabilities discouraged Soviet defensive preparations that might have reduced the catastrophic effects of the eventual invasion. Military commanders received intelligence briefings that understated German strength and overstated German commitment to maintaining peaceful relations with the Soviet Union. Golikov's personal expertise made him particularly dangerous to Stalin's strategic assumptions. Unlike political appointees whose knowledge of military affairs remained superficial, Golikov possessed detailed understanding of German military doctrine, organizational capabilities, and strategic culture. His assessments carried weight with other military professionals who recognized his competence and experience. The intelligence chief's access to classified German communications provided him with insights into German planning that contradicted public German statements about continued cooperation with the Soviet Union. Soviet signals intelligence intercepted German military communications discussing offensive operations, logistics requirements, and coordination between different army groups preparing for eastern operations. This technical intelligence eliminated any possibility that German activities could be explained by defensive preparations. Golikov's knowledge of historical precedents also informed his assessment of German intentions. He had studied German military operations during the First World War and recognized similar patterns in current German preparations. The systematic concentration of forces, construction of forward supply bases, and reconnaissance activities matched German procedures preceding previous offensive operations. The most frustrating aspect of Golikov's position involved his inability to communicate directly with senior military commanders who would bear responsibility for defending against German attacks. Stalin's centralized control of information flow prevented Golikov from briefing defense officials who might have implemented practical defensive measures based on accurate intelligence assessments. By May 1941, Golikov possessed comprehensive intelligence indicating that German forces would attack within weeks. His final pre-invasion assessment documented German achievement of offensive readiness across the entire eastern frontier. This report identified the specific date German forces would achieve peak readiness and predicted the general outline of German strategic objectives. Stalin's rejection of Golukov's final warnings demonstrated the complete triumph of ideology over evidence that characterized Soviet decision-making in 1941. Despite possessing the most accurate intelligence about German intentions available anywhere in the world, the Soviet Union remained essentially defenseless when the invasion actually commenced. The systematic silencing of professional intelligence assessment had eliminated the Soviet Union's primary advantage in the approaching conflict. At precisely 15 minutes past 3 on the morning of June 22, 1941, the largest military offensive in human history shattered the illusion that had dominated Soviet strategic thinking for 2 years. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, approximately 3.8 million German troops, supported by 3,400 tanks and 4,900 aircraft, crossed into Soviet territory. The scale of the attack made denial impossible. Yet Stalin's initial reaction demonstrated how completely his psychological investment in the non-aggression pact had disconnected him from military reality. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, commenced with a coordinated artillery barrage involving over 7,000 guns firing simultaneously across the 2,000-kilometer frontier. This bombardment targeted Soviet command posts, communication centers, airfields, and troop concentrations identified through months of aerial reconnaissance. Within the first hour of combat, German forces had severed most communication links between Soviet frontier units and their higher headquarters. German air attacks achieved devastating success against Soviet aircraft caught unprepared on their airfields. Luftwaffe bombers and fighters struck 66 Soviet airfields during the first day of operations, destroying approximately 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground. Soviet pilots who managed to get their aircraft airborne found themselves outnumbered and operating without effective ground control or tactical coordination. The Wehrmacht's ground assault penetrated Soviet defensive positions with shocking speed and effectiveness. German panzer groups, employing the proven blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Western Europe, punched through Soviet border defenses and advanced rapidly toward key strategic objectives. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, and Army Group South moved toward Kiev and the vital Ukrainian industrial region. Soviet frontier forces, caught in peacetime configurations and lacking orders for defensive operations, offered fragmented resistance that German attacks easily overwhelmed. Many Soviet units remained in barracks when German artillery fire began falling on their positions. Others found themselves surrounded by rapidly advancing German forces before they could establish coherent defensive positions. The massive scale of the German offensive became apparent within hours of the initial attacks. German forces were advancing simultaneously along multiple axes, supported by overwhelming air superiority and concentrated armor formations. This was not the limited border provocation that Soviet propaganda would later claim, but a full-scale invasion designed to destroy the Soviet Union as a military and political entity. Communication breakdown prevented accurate assessment of the military situation during the first crucial hours of the invasion. German attacks had severed telephone lines connecting frontier units with district headquarters. Radio communications remained sporadic and often contradictory, as inexperienced operators struggled with equipment they had not been trained to use under combat conditions. The initial reports reaching Moscow described scattered border incidents rather than coordinated invasion. This confusion reflected both communication difficulties and the psychological inability of Soviet commanders to accept the magnitude of the attack they were witnessing. Many officers continued to believe they were dealing with unauthorized actions by local German commanders rather than a deliberate attack ordered by Hitler himself. Stalin's immediate response to the first invasion reports revealed the depth of his psychological investment in maintaining peaceful relations with Germany. Rather than ordering general mobilization and defensive measures, he instructed his subordinates to contact German authorities and resolve what he believed must be some kind of misunderstanding. This reaction demonstrated how completely his strategic assumptions had blinded him to obvious military reality. The Soviet leader's first meeting with senior military officials on the morning of June 22nd lasted from approximately 4:30 until 6:30 and produced no coherent response to the German invasion. Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of General Staff Georgy Zhukov briefed Stalin on the limited information available about German attacks, but the Soviet leader remained convinced that unauthorized German actions could be resolved through diplomatic channels. Stalin's refusal to acknowledge the reality of invasion prevented effective Soviet military response during the most crucial hours of the conflict. Soviet forces remained under orders not to pursue German aircraft across the border or take other actions that might escalate the situation. This restraint eliminated any possibility of organized counterattacks that might have disrupted German offensive operations. The practical consequences of Stalin's denial became apparent in Soviet military communications throughout the morning of June 22nd. Military districts received contradictory orders, instructing them to repel German attacks while avoiding actions that might provoke further German aggression. These impossible instructions reflected Stalin's continued belief that the invasion could be stopped through political rather than military means. German success during the first day of operations exceeded even the most optimistic Wehrmacht projections. Panzer groups advanced up to 60 kilometers into Soviet territory, capturing strategic bridges and road junctions that Soviet forces had been ordered not to destroy. German aircraft achieved virtual air superiority across the entire front, enabling close support for ground forces and interdiction of Soviet supply lines. The collapse of Soviet frontier defenses occurred with devastating speed due to the combination of tactical surprise and strategic paralysis imposed by Stalin's refusal to authorize defensive preparations. Soviet units that might have offered effective resistance, if properly positioned and supplied, found themselves fighting from disadvantageous positions without adequate ammunition or communication support. The human cost of Stalin's miscalculation became apparent within hours of the German offensive. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died in their barracks or while attempting to reach defensive positions they had never been permitted to prepare. Entire units disappeared in the confusion of the initial attack, overwhelmed by German forces before they could establish organized resistance. By the evening of June 22nd, German forces had achieved virtually all their first-day objectives along the entire front. The Wehrmacht had penetrated Soviet defenses to depths ranging from 20 to 60 kilometers, destroyed most of the Soviet Air Force, and captured tens of thousands of prisoners. Most importantly, German forces had achieved the strategic surprise that made possible the massive encirclement operations that would characterize the next phase of the campaign. Stalin's eventual acceptance of invasion reality came only after the magnitude of German success made denial impossible. The systematic destruction of Soviet frontier forces and the obvious coordination of German attacks across the entire Eastern Front eliminated any possibility that these were unauthorized actions by local German commanders. The psychological transformation that occurred in Stalin during the first hours of the invasion would have profound consequences for Soviet war strategy. His recognition that all his strategic assumptions had been completely wrong created a crisis of confidence that would affect Soviet decision-making throughout the coming months of catastrophic military defeats. The cascading failures that followed Stalin's belated recognition of invasion reality demonstrated how a single catastrophic miscalculation could paralyze an entire state apparatus. The systematic unraveling of Soviet defensive capabilities during the summer and autumn of 1941 resulted directly from the strategic blindness that had prevented adequate preparation for the most predictable attack in modern military history. Soviet mobilization efforts, when finally implemented on June 22nd, revealed the practical consequences of maintaining military forces in peacetime configurations while facing a coordinated enemy offensive. The Red Army possessed impressive numbers on paper, but these forces remained scattered across vast distances in garrison towns, training centers, and administrative locations that provided no strategic advantage against advancing German columns. The mobilization process required calling up approximately 5.3 million reservists and organizing them into combat units capable of effective military operations. However, this transformation normally required weeks of preparation, equipment distribution, and unit training. German forces had eliminated this preparation time by achieving complete tactical surprise along the entire frontier. Soviet communication systems, designed for peacetime administration rather than wartime command and control, collapsed under the stress of coordinating rapid military operations across multiple fronts. The NKVD communication network, though extensive, focused on internal security rather than military coordination. Military communication systems lacked the redundancy and security measures necessary for operations under enemy fire. The industrial consequences of losing the initiative became apparent within weeks of the German invasion. Soviet factories in western regions that produced tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and other military equipment found themselves within German artillery range or facing imminent capture. The massive industrial evacuation that followed represented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the war, but required months to restore production capacity. Soviet tank production, which had reached approximately 2,300 tanks monthly by early 1941, dropped to fewer than 800 tanks monthly by September 1941 due to factory relocations and raw material shortages. Aircraft production similarly declined from approximately 500 aircraft monthly to fewer than 200 monthly during the same period. These production shortfalls occurred precisely when Soviet forces needed maximum equipment replacement to compensate for massive battlefield losses. The human cost of Stalin's strategic failure mounted with shocking speed during the first months of fighting. German encirclement operations around Minsk captured approximately 300,000 Soviet troops within 2 weeks of the invasion. The Kiev encirclement in September resulted in approximately 660,000 prisoners. By December 1941, German forces had captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers, representing more than half the Red Army's pre-war strength. These prisoner totals reflected more than tactical defeats. They represented the systematic collapse of Soviet military organization caused by inadequate preparation and strategic surprise. Soviet units surrounded by rapidly advancing German forces lacked the training, equipment, and leadership necessary for breakthrough operations that might have enabled escape from encirclement. Soviet officer casualties during the first months of fighting eliminated much of the Red Army's professional leadership. German targeting of command posts, combined with Soviet officers' tendency to expose themselves while attempting to maintain unit cohesion, resulted in disproportionate losses among experienced military leaders. These casualties further degraded Soviet military effectiveness at precisely the moment when professional competence became most crucial. The geographical scope of German advances demonstrated the strategic consequences of losing the initiative in modern warfare. By November 1941, German forces had advanced over 1,000 kilometers from their starting positions. capturing territory containing approximately 40% of the Soviet Union's population and 50% of its industrial capacity. This territorial loss included most of Ukraine's agricultural regions and many of the Soviet Union's most important industrial centers. Stalin's psychological recovery from his initial shock gradually enabled more effective Soviet resistance, but this transformation required months while German forces continued advancing toward strategically vital objectives. The Soviet leader's first effective military directive, issued on June 29th, ordered the implementation of scorched earth policies designed to deny German forces access to Soviet resources. The Scorched Earth campaign represented acknowledgement that German advances could not be immediately stopped through conventional military operations. Soviet forces received orders to destroy all equipment, supplies, infrastructure, and resources that might benefit German operations. This policy included demolition of bridges, railways, power stations, fuel depots, and even food supplies that might sustain German troops. Soviet partisan operations behind German lines gradually developed into a significant strategic factor, though these activities required months to achieve meaningful effectiveness. The NKVD's pre-war preparation for potential guerrilla warfare provided some organizational foundation for partisan activities, but developing effective resistance networks required time that initial Soviet military failures had not provided. The international consequences of Soviet military defeats during 1941 nearly eliminated the Soviet Union as a factor in the global war against Nazi Germany. Britain and the United States, observing apparently imminent Soviet collapse, began preparing for a world war that would continue without Soviet participation. Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union remained limited during the first months of fighting due to doubts about Soviet survival. Soviet industrial evacuation to locations beyond German reach ultimately proved crucial for long-term survival. But this process required massive resources and months of reduced production during the most critical period of the war. Approximately 1,500 factories were relocated eastward during the second half of 1941, along with millions of workers and their families. The railway transportation requirements for this evacuation strained Soviet logistical capabilities that were simultaneously supporting military operations on multiple fronts. Every train carrying evacuated factory equipment eastward represented transportation capacity unavailable for moving troops, ammunition, or supplies to forces fighting German advances. Soviet agricultural production collapsed in occupied territories, creating food supply problems that persisted throughout the war. Ukraine's grain production, which normally supplied much of the Soviet Union's food requirements, fell under German control. This loss forced increased reliance on less productive agricultural regions and complicated the already difficult task of feeding Soviet military forces and civilian populations. The strategic transformation required to fight effectively against German forces demanded fundamental changes in Soviet military doctrine, training, and equipment that would require years to fully implement. The Red Army's pre-war emphasis on offensive operations proved inadequate for the defensive warfare that characterized most fighting during 1941 and 1942. By December 1941, when Soviet forces finally achieved their first significant victory by halting German advances outside Moscow, the cost of Stalin's initial miscalculation had become apparent. The Soviet Union had lost millions of soldiers, vast territories containing crucial industrial and agricultural resources, and most of its pre-war military equipment. Recovery from these losses would require the mobilization of Soviet society on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. The ultimate irony of Stalin's catastrophic intelligence failure lay not in its immediate consequences, devastating though they proved, but in its demonstration of how absolute power could transform a nation's greatest potential strength into its fatal vulnerability. The Soviet Union possessed the world's most extensive intelligence network, yet this advantage became meaningless when political pressure systematically corrupted the analysis of gathered information. The long-term consequences of Stalin's miscalculation extended far beyond the immediate military disasters of 1941. The massive loss of territory, industrial capacity, and human resources during the first months of fighting forced fundamental changes in Soviet society that would influence the country's development for decades. The total mobilization required to survive German invasion created social and economic patterns that persisted long after the war's conclusion. Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War, achieved at a cost of 27 million lives, obscured the reality that this outcome remained uncertain for over 2 years after the German invasion. Without American Lend-Lease aid, British naval support that prevented German control of global sea lanes, and Germany's simultaneous war against multiple enemies, Soviet survival would have been highly questionable. The human cost of Stalin's strategic blindness defies comprehension. Military casualties during the first 6 months of fighting exceeded 3 million killed, wounded, and captured. Civilian deaths in occupied territories reached similar numbers. These losses occurred largely because adequate preparation could have reduced German tactical surprise and enabled more effective initial resistance. Historical analysis of Stalin's decision-making reveals the systematic process by which ideological conviction overrode empirical evidence. The Soviet leaders' investment in the Non-Aggression Pact as a strategic masterpiece made contradictory information psychologically unacceptable. This psychological dynamic affected not only Stalin personally, but also subordinates who learned to provide information that supported rather than challenged official assumptions. The intelligence failure that enabled Operation Barbarossa established patterns of political interference with military analysis that would characterize Soviet decision-making throughout the Cold War period. The systematic punishment of intelligence officers who provided unwelcome assessments created institutional pressure to confirm rather than challenge leadership expectations. Soviet educational and propaganda systems after 1945 minimized discussion of the intelligence failures that preceded the German invasion. Official histories emphasized German treachery and surprise rather than examining how obvious German preparations could have been ignored. This historical amnesia prevented learning from one of the most costly intelligence failures in human history. The professional military literature that emerged after the war focused on tactical and operational lessons from fighting German forces while avoiding analysis of the strategic blindness that made such fighting necessary. Soviet military academies taught students about combined arms coordination, urban warfare, and partisan operations, without examining how political pressure had corrupted intelligence assessment. International intelligence services studied Soviet intelligence failures as examples of how political systems could undermine their own security apparatus. The Central Intelligence Agency and British Secret Intelligence Service incorporated analysis of Soviet mistakes into their own training programs, though whether this prevented similar failures in their own operations remains questionable. The technological revolution in intelligence gathering that occurred during the Cold War did not eliminate the fundamental problem that Stalin's failure had revealed. Signals intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, and electronic surveillance could provide unprecedented amounts of information, but political pressure could still corrupt the analysis of that information. Modern intelligence failures, from Pearl Harbor to September 11th, demonstrate persistent patterns similar to those that characterized Soviet analysis in 1941. The systematic dismissal of warnings that contradict established policies, the punishment of analysts who provide unwelcome assessments, and the tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support existing assumptions continue to plague intelligence organizations throughout the world. The specific circumstances that enabled Stalin's miscalculation cannot be replicated. But the psychological and institutional dynamics that caused his failure remain relevant for any organization that must assess threats and make decisions based on incomplete information. The Soviet experience demonstrates how quickly competent intelligence gathering can become meaningless if political pressure systematically distorts analytical conclusions. Stalin's survival of his own catastrophic miscalculation resulted from geographical advantages, Allied support, and German strategic errors rather than any wisdom in his original assessment. The vast distances involved in Russian warfare, the industrial capacity of the United States, and Hitler's decision to fight simultaneous wars against multiple enemies provided the Soviet Union with opportunities for recovery that might not exist in future conflicts. The most sobering aspect of this historical episode involves recognition that similar failures remain possible in contemporary international relations. Political leaders continue to possess incentives to dismiss intelligence that contradicts their strategic assumptions. Intelligence organizations remain vulnerable to institutional pressure to provide assessments that support rather than challenge official policies. The millions of Soviet citizens who died because their leader refused to acknowledge obvious evidence of impending attack left no detailed record of their thoughts about the intelligence failure that cost their lives. Their sacrifice purchased eventual victory, but at a price that adequate preparation might have significantly reduced. Perhaps the most important lesson from Stalin's catastrophic miscalculation involves the recognition that intelligence gathering without independent analysis provides no protection against strategic surprise. The Soviet Union possessed exceptional information about German intentions, but lacked the institutional independence necessary to act on that information effectively. Contemporary democratic societies face different but related challenges in maintaining intelligence effectiveness while preserving civilian control over military and intelligence institutions. The Soviet example demonstrates the potential costs of allowing political considerations to override empirical analysis. But finding the proper balance between independence and accountability remains a persistent challenge for any intelligence organization. The young intelligence officers who tried to warn Stalin about German invasion plans and faced imprisonment or execution for their efforts remind us that speaking truth to power often requires personal courage that extends beyond professional duty. These forgotten heroes of Soviet intelligence deserve recognition not for their success in preventing catastrophe, but for their integrity in the face of systematic pressure to remain silent. The ultimate verdict on Stalin's intelligence failure rests not with historians, but with the families of those who died, because adequate preparation for the most predictable attack in modern warfare was prevented by one man's refusal to accept unwelcome information. Their sacrifice stands as permanent testimony to the potential consequences when political power becomes more important than empirical truth in matters of national survival. Remember to subscribe to stay informed about the hidden stories that shaped our world, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering the remarkable human dramas behind the greatest events in history.